My DIL laced my Christmas coffee to steal my home, but she forgot I was a pharmacist for 37 years. One clever cup swap later, her secret ingredient backfired, and I began a cinematic battle to reclaim my life. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The coffee smelled like a peace offering, but it tasted like a death warrant. I stood in my own kitchen in Portland, the house I had owned for 35 years, while my daughter-in-law Patricia watched me with a smile that was too bright, too fixed, and entirely too predatory. She had handed me the mug with a flourish, claiming it was a special family recipe for Christmas morning, but the bitter metallic tang hiding under the cinnamon and nutmeg told a different story. 37 years as a pharmacist had taught me that chemicals have a specific signature, and this one screamed of synthetic laxatives meant to keep an old man trapped in a bathroom while the rest of the world moved on without him. I did not drink. I waited for her to turn toward the stove to check the cinnamon rolls, and in one swift, silent motion, I swapped my spiked mug for her clean one. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a sharp jolt of adrenaline that made my fingers tingle. But my hand remained steady. I had raised my son Devin in this house after my wife Anne passed, building every memory into these floorboards, and now I was being treated like a squatter in my own life. "Ted, you really should drink it before it gets bitter," Patricia said, her back still turned. I took a sip from her cup, the pure, unadulterated roast hitting my tongue with a heat that felt like a battle cry. "It is delicious, Patricia," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "Truly a Christmas to remember." She finally turned, her eyes darting to my mug to confirm I had swallowed the bait. Satisfied, she picked up the other cup, the one she had prepared for me, and took a long, deep gulp while checking a text on her phone. I watched the liquid disappear down her throat, a cold weight of justice settling in my gut. She had spent the last year living under my roof rent-free, whispering to Devin about nursing homes and investment properties, and now she was drinking her own malice. The morning had started with a crisp, clear December sky, but the atmosphere inside the house was thick with a year of accumulated slights. It had peaked 3 days earlier when Patricia suggested, with all the warmth of a glacier, that I should check into a Marriott for Christmas so her parents could have my bedroom. She wanted me invisible. She wanted the house. And as I looked at Devin, who sat at the table staring at his phone to avoid my gaze, I realized she wanted my son to be as hollow as she was. A low clatter came from the hallway, the sound of the old furnace kicking on, but it felt like a ticking clock. I knew the Senna would hit her system within 40 minutes on an empty stomach. She thought she was clearing the stage for her parents' arrival at 2:20, but she had just set her own trap. Patricia set the cup down, her expression shifting from triumph to a sudden flickering mask of confusion. Her hand went to her midsection for a fleeting second, her fingers twitching against the navy blazer she wore for her presentation-style performance of the perfect hostess. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked, my voice dripping with forced concern. "I am fine," she snapped, though her face had paled to the color of unbaked dough. "Just a lot to do before my parents get here." She moved toward the sink, but her steps were jerky, lacking the calculated grace she usually projected. I felt a microcost of this victory. My son was still sitting there, a silent accomplice by omission, and the rift between us was widening into a canyon. I had sold Wilson's Pharmacy 3 years ago to enjoy my retirement, but standing here, I realized I was back on the clock, dispensing a very different kind of medicine. The doorbell rang, a sharp, piercing sound that made Patricia jump. It was only 11, far too early for her parents. I moved toward the door, my shoes clicking on the hardwood Anne and I had polished together for decades. When I opened it, my neighbor Quentin was standing there, looking windblown and uncharacteristically serious. "Ted, sorry to drop by," he said, his eyes darting past me to where Patricia was now leaning heavily against the kitchen counter. "I saw something at the coffee shop on Hawthorne last week that I think we need to talk about." I felt the world narrow to a target as I saw Patricia's eyes go wide with a sudden sharp jolt of terror. Quentin stepped into the foyer, the cold air following him in like a silent witness. He was a realtor, a man who made his living reading the fine print of people's lives, and he looked like he had found a massive discrepancy in mine. Patricia had frozen in the kitchen, her hand still clutched to her stomach, her brilliant Christmas smile now a jagged line of fear. "I saw you with Mark Davis last Tuesday," Quentin said, looking straight at Patricia. "At the Hawthorne Hideaway. You were looking at a residential sales listing for this address." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breath. I felt a sharp sensory jolt, the smell of the pine garland on the banister suddenly feeling suffocating. My son Devin finally looked up from his phone, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. "Mark is just an old friend," Patricia stammered, her voice thin and high. "We were just talking about investment opportunities." Quentin shook his head, his expression grim. "You were talking about a quick sale. You told him the owner was ready to move into assisted living and needed to liquidate the asset by February." I felt the betrayal like a physical blow to the sternum. They weren't just waiting for me to fade away. They were actively putting a price tag on my sanctuary while I was still breathing in it. My pharmacy records, my deed, my life insurance, the things I'd found moved in my study. It all clicked into place like a loaded magazine. "Quentin, thank you," I said, my voice deathly quiet. "I think I can take it from here." Quentin nodded, shot one last look of disgust at Patricia, and backed out the door. I closed it and turned to face the two people I had allowed into my heart and my home. Patricia was swaying slightly now, her face transitioning from the white of shock to a sickly, translucent green. The laxative was beginning its work, a chemical deadline that didn't care about her real estate ambitions. "Is it true, Devin?" I asked. "Dad, it's not what it looks like," he whispered, but he couldn't meet my eyes. He was 38 years old, and in that moment, he looked like a child caught breaking a window. "Patricia says we need our own space, that the house is too much for you to handle." "I handled this house for 30 years before she knew you existed," I said. "I handled your mother's illness in this house. I handled every cent of your college tuition from this house." A sudden, sharp groan escaped Patricia's lips. She doubled over, her hands clutching her abdomen as if she were trying to hold her internal organs in place. The Senna was hitting with the full force of a concentrated dose. I need to," she gasped, her eyes darting toward the stairs. I stood in her way, my arms crossed. "I thought you wanted to talk about Christmas dinner, Patricia. You were so insistent that I stay presentable for your parents." She didn't answer. She bolted, her heels clattering like gunfire on the stairs as she scrambled for the bathroom. A second later, the door slammed with such violence that the picture frames in the hallway rattled. The sounds that followed were visceral and undeniable, a humiliating symphony that stripped away every ounce of the elegant hostess persona she had spent all morning crafting. Devin stood up looking horrified. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Devin. I just drank the coffee I was supposed to drink, and she drank the coffee she made for me." I watched the realization wash over him. He knew exactly what she had done. He had sat there and watched her lace my drink, and he had said nothing. The weight of that silence felt heavier than the house itself. I felt a vulnerability ping, a sudden aching wish that Anne were here to tell me I was wrong, that our son wasn't capable of this. But the evidence was screaming through the bathroom door. I moved to my study and locked the door, leaving Devin alone in the kitchen with the sounds of his wife's disgrace. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Charles Morrison, my old colleague from the lab next to the pharmacy. "Charles," I said when he picked up, "I have a sample for a toxicology screen, and I need it documented. Chain of custody, the whole works." I went to the refrigerator, took the small container of the spiked coffee I'd tucked away while Patricia was running upstairs, and sealed it with tape. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear. It was the cold, hard clarity of a man who realized he was no longer at home. He was in a combat zone. I heard Devin pounding on the bathroom door, calling Patricia's name, his voice frantic. I ignored them. I had work to do. By the time her parents arrived at 2 Croix, the narrative of this family was going to change forever. I looked out the window at the frost on the lawn. The game had shifted from domestic tension to open warfare, and I was the only one who knew where the mines were buried. "I'll be at the lab in 20 minutes," I told Charles. I stepped out of the study, my navy blazer buttoned, my head held high. I walked past the kitchen where the cinnamon rolls were burning, the smell of charred sugar filling the air. The drive to the lab was a blur of gray Portland streets and white-hot anger. Charles was waiting for me at the service entrance, his face etched with the kind of professional concern that only comes from decades of shared history. He took the sealed container from my hand, like it was a piece of unexploded ordnance. "Ted, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, leading me into the sterile fluorescent light of the testing area. "I've seen a predator, Charles. Just run the screen. I need to know exactly what she put in there." I sat on a stool, the smell of rubbing alcohol and ozone grounding me. While Charles worked, I pulled out my phone and made a second call. Dorothy Anderson. She had handled Anne's estate and my retirement papers. She was a woman who dealt in ironclad contracts and didn't believe in coincidences. "Dorothy, I need a new will, and I need a property protection notice filed with the county, immediately." "Ted, it's Christmas Day," she said, her voice softening. "What happened?" "They're trying to sell the house while I'm still in it, Dorothy, and I think she tried to poison me this morning to keep me out of the way." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll meet you in my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Don't sign anything. Don't even agree to a grocery list. If they ask, you're just tired." I hung up, just as Charles walked back over, holding a printout. His jaw was set tight. "Concentrated senna extract and a trace of magnesium citrate," he said, tapping the paper. "It's not lethal, Ted, but it's a massive dose. In a man your age with your blood pressure history, it could have caused severe dehydration or even a cardiac event if you'd stayed in that bathroom long enough." "It's assault," I said. "Legally?" "Yes. In Oregon, administering a substance without consent is a felony if intent to harm can be proven. And given what you told me about the house..." I took the report from him, the paper crisp and cold in my fingers. This was my leverage. This was the artifact that would flip the power in my house. I thanked Charles and drove back, the sun beginning to dip low in the winter sky. When I pulled into the driveway, Patricia's parents' car was already there, a pristine silver Mercedes that looked like it belonged in a showroom, not in front of my 1920s Craftsman. I straightened my tie in the rearview mirror. I had 20 minutes of the peaceful lunch left. I entered the house to find the dining room in a state of absolute apologetic chaos. Helen and Clarence Carter were sitting at the table, looking profoundly uncomfortable. The fine china was set, the turkey was carved, but the hostess was missing. The sounds from upstairs had moved from the bathroom to the bedroom, low, agonized moans, and the frantic voice of my son. "Ted!" Helen stood up, her pearls clicking against her silk blouse. "We were so worried. Devin said Patricia had a sudden stomach flu." "A very sudden one," I said, smiling warmly as I took my seat at the head of the table. "She was so vibrant this morning when she made me that coffee. Such a shame." Clarence looked at the empty chair where Patricia should have been. "It's quite distressing. We've never seen her like this." I picked up the carving knife and served myself a piece of turkey. The meat was moist, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I'm sure she'll be down eventually. In the meantime, Clarence, I'd love to hear more about your work in Eugene. "Quentin mentioned you've been looking into Portland real estate lately?" Clarence blinked, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Portland?" "No, we haven't been looking at anything here. Why would we?" My pulse spiked. If the parents didn't know about the sale, then Patricia and Devin were acting entirely on their own, likely planning to pocket the equity and move the five of us into something smaller and cheaper, with me in a mother-in-law suite or a facility. "Just a misunderstanding, I'm sure," I said, taking a sip of water. Suddenly, the bedroom door upstairs flew open. I heard Patricia's voice, shrill and desperate, echoing down the stairs. "Devin, I can't. I need more water. I feel like I'm dying." The Carters looked toward the ceiling, their faces pale with embarrassment. I continued eating, my movements slow and deliberate. Every second she spent in that room was a second she wasn't selling my home. "I'll go check on her," Helen said, standing up. "No, Helen, stay. I said, my voice commanding enough to stop her in her tracks. "I'm a pharmacist, remember? I've seen this before. It just needs to run its course. Why don't we talk about the house? I've lived here 35 years. It's worth a fortune now, or so I'm told." Devin appeared in the doorway then, looking absolutely wrecked. His hair was disheveled, and there was a dark stain on his shirt. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw real, naked fear in his eyes. He realized I wasn't just sitting at the table. I was presiding over a funeral for their plans. "Dad, can I talk to you in the kitchen?" he whispered. I stood up, excusing myself to the Carters with a polite nod. I followed my son into the kitchen, the very place where the coffee had been poured. He turned to me, his hands shaking. "She's really sick, Dad. Like she can't stop shaking. Did you do something?" I leaned in close, my voice a jagged whisper. "I didn't do a thing, Devin. I just let her drink what she intended for me. And if you don't start telling me the truth about Mark Davis and the Hawthorne meeting, the next person I call won't be a realtor. It'll be the police." Devin's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak, but a loud, crashing sound came from the dining room, the sound of Helen screaming. I bolted back into the dining room to find Helen clutching her chest, pointing at the window. Patricia had emerged from the stairs, but she didn't look like the woman who had handed me that coffee. She was wearing a bathrobe, her hair matted with sweat, her face a ghostly, translucent gray. She was clutching the banister as if it were a life raft, her eyes wild and unfocused. "Ted," she wheezed, her gaze locking onto mine. "What did you—" She didn't finish. Her knees buckled and she slid down the last 3 steps, collapsing in a heap on the hardwood floor. Clarence rushed to her side, shouting her name, while Devin stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a coward paralyzed by his own choices. I stepped forward, my pharmacist training overriding my anger for a split second. I checked her pulse. Thready, but fast. Dehydration. The dose had been even stronger than Charles estimated. "Call an ambulance," Clarence yelled at me. I looked at him, then at Patricia, then at the dining table where my life was being negotiated behind my back. "I'll call them," I said, pulling out my phone. "But before I do, Clarence, you might want to ask your daughter why she has a concentrated laxative in her system on Christmas morning." The room went thinner than air. Helen looked at me, her mouth hanging open. "What are you talking about?" "She tried to drug me," I said, my voice steady and cold, "to keep me out of the way. But she got the cups mixed up. Now, Devin, are you going to help her, or are you going to keep standing there like a statue?" Devin finally moved, kneeling next to his wife, but he wouldn't look at his father-in-law. I dialed 911 and gave the address, my voice calm, the professional in me taking over. As I hung up, I felt a sharp sensory jolt, the cold draft from the front door that hadn't been closed properly. It felt like the house was exhaling. The next hour was a blur of flashing lights and oxygen masks. The paramedics loaded Patricia onto a gurney. She was conscious now, but barely, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of pure, unadulterated hatred and soul-crushing humiliation. Her parents followed the ambulance in their Mercedes, leaving me alone in the house with my son. The silence that followed was heavy, vibrating with the ghost of the siren. Devin sat on the bottom step, his head in his hands. "I didn't know she was going to drug you," he whispered. "I swear, Dad, she just said she'd handle it." "Handle it by making me sick in my own home?" I asked, standing over him. "Handle it by selling the roof over my head." He looked up, his eyes red. "We're broke, Dad. The marketing firm Patricia worked for went under 6 months ago. We've been living on credit cards. She thought if we sold this place, we could get $750,000. She said you'd be happier in a community with people your own age. She lied to you, Devin, and you let her." I walked into my study and closed the door. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours installing 2 small motion-activated cameras I'd bought weeks ago but had been too hesitant to use. One went on the bookshelf in the living room, disguised as a digital clock. The other went in my study, aimed directly at my file cabinet. If they were going to play for the house, I was going to record every move of the endgame. By 6 a.m. on December 26th, I had a plan. I wasn't just going to defend my home, I was going to dismantle their ability to ever threaten it again. I made a fresh pot of coffee, my own beans, my own water, and sat on the porch. The sun was rising over the frost-covered garden. At 8:20 a.m., Devin came downstairs, looking like he hadn't slept either. He was carrying a suitcase. "I'm going to the hospital to get Patricia," he said. I didn't look at him. "When you bring her back, tell her to check the mail. There's a formal notice from my attorney arriving today. And Devin, don't even think about touching the file cabinet in my study. I'm watching." He stopped, his hand on the doorknob. "Watching how?" "I just sipped my coffee." "New year, new technology, son." He left, and I felt a grim satisfaction. The first move of the counteroffensive had landed. But I knew Patricia. She wouldn't go down without a fight. She'd come back with a new angle, a new lie, or a new weapon. I just had to make sure I was the one holding the evidence when she did. My phone buzzed. A text from Charles. Toxicology report finalized and notarized. "Do you want me to file the police report or are you holding it?" I typed back. "Hold it. I want to see the look on her face when I show it to her myself." The house was a tomb for the next 48 hours. When Patricia returned from the hospital on the 27th, she didn't come in with a bang. She crept in like a wounded animal, her face gaunt, her eyes avoiding every mirror she passed. She retreated to the guest room and stayed there, the door locked, the silence between us more deafening than the screaming match I'd expected. I spent the time with Dorothy. We filed a notice of property protection with Multnomah County. Any transaction involving my address now required my physical signature, verified in person by my attorney, with a mandatory 48-hour cooling-off period. I was effectively locking the doors to my own equity. On December 29th, the first hope threat swing hit. Devin approached me in the kitchen, his voice trembling with a forced artificial softness. "Dad," Patricia wants to apologize. She's had a breakthrough. She realized how much pressure she was under and she snapped. "Can we just talk?" I set my book down. "I'm always open to a conversation, Devin, as long as the truth is at the table." We met in the living room. Patricia sat on the edge of the sofa, a pashmina wrapped around her shoulders as if she were the victim of a great tragedy. She looked at me with watery eyes, the same ones that had been calculating my demise only days before. "Ted, I am so sorry," she whispered. "The stress of losing my job. I wasn't myself. I thought if I could just get us some breathing room, I could fix everything. I never meant to hurt you. You meant to drug me, Patricia. Let's not use metaphors." She flinched. "It was a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. But we're family. Can't we move past this? We want to stay. We want to make it up to you." I looked at the digital clock on the bookshelf. The camera was live, streaming her every word to the cloud. I felt a microcost of my own dignity playing this game, but I knew I had to let her dig the hole deeper. "And the house?" I asked. "The meeting with Mark Davis?" She didn't miss a beat. "We were just getting an appraisal, so we'd know our options if we ever wanted to buy a place together, all of us. A bigger place, with a garden for you." The lie was so smooth it almost had a polish to it. If I hadn't seen the listing agreement Quentin mentioned, I might have felt a flicker of doubt. But I knew she was lying. And more importantly, I knew she didn't know I knew. "I'll think about it," I said, standing up. "But for now, I need some space." I went to my study and pulled up the feed on my laptop. As soon as I left the room, the pashmina dropped. Patricia leaned toward Devin, her face transforming into a mask of sharp, jagged intensity. "He's buying it," she whispered, her voice a hiss. "We just need to get him to sign the power of attorney papers for medical reasons before he changes his mind. Then we can list the house on the 5th and be out by February. Devin looks sick. Patty, he's not going to sign that. He will if he thinks it's for his own protection," she snapped. "He's old, Devin. He's starting to forget things. We just have to document it." I sat in the dark of my study, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. They weren't just trying to sell the house anymore. They were going to try to declare me incompetent. They were coming for my mind, my autonomy, my very identity. I felt a sharp sensory jolt, the sound of the file cabinet drawer in the other room being tried. My study door was locked, but I heard the rattle of the handle. They were looking for the deed. I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out the toxicology report Charles had given me. I looked at the notarized seal. This wasn't just paper, it was a shield. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the feed. At 3 a.m., I saw Patricia in the kitchen, searching through the junk drawer, looking for the spare key to my study. She looked like a ghost in the infrared light, her movements frantic and predatory. The game had reached its peak. They were no longer family. They were insurgents in my home. The next morning, January 1st, I came downstairs with a suitcase of my own. Devin and Patricia were at the table, their expressions wary. "Going somewhere, Dad?" Devin asked. "Just to see an old friend," I said, my voice light, "and to drop some things off at the bank." I saw Patricia's eyes dart to my study door. She thought she had a window. I let her think it. I walked out the door, drove around the block, and parked 3 houses down where I could watch the feed on my phone. 5 minutes later, Patricia was at my study door with a crowbar. The metal shrieked as it hit the wood. My pulse spiked. I didn't move. I watched her pry the door open. I watched her rush to the file cabinet. I watched her face go from triumph to absolute soul-crushing confusion as she opened the top drawer and found it empty except for a single large photograph. It was a picture of her, taken from the hidden camera, prying the door open with the crowbar. And underneath it, in bold letters, I had written, "I see you." I put the car in gear and drove back to the house. It was time to end this. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the front door fly open. Patricia was standing there, the crowbar still in her hand, her face a distorted mask of rage and fear. "Where are they?" she screamed. "Where are the papers?" I stepped out of the car, the toxicology report in my hand. I walked toward her, my footsteps steady on the concrete. "The papers are with my lawyer, Patricia, along with the video of you breaking into my room, and the lab report proving you poisoned me." I stopped 10 feet away from her. "You have 2 weeks to find a new place to live. If you're still here on the 15th, I'm calling the police, the county recorder, and the local news." Devin came out behind her, looking like he wanted to vanish. "Dad, please." I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man who had let this happen. 2 weeks, Devin, not a day more. I walked past them into my house, the deadbolt sliding home behind me with the most satisfying click I had ever heard. The house was quiet. My house. Mine again. I went to the kitchen and made a fresh cup of coffee. No secret ingredients, just justice. The silence that followed the 2-week ultimatum was not peaceful. It was a cold, calculated pressure that filled the hallways like rising water. Patricia did not leave. She spent the next 3 days in the living room, her eyes fixed on the door of my study, as if she could burn through the wood with her gaze. I watched the camera feeds on my phone, seeing her and Devin in low-intensity confrontations that usually ended with her shouting that they had nowhere to go, and him staring at his hands in defeat. On January 4th, I woke to the sound of a key scratching at the lock of my study. I didn't move from my bed. I pulled up the live stream and watched Patricia trying to pick the new lock with a hairpin, her face twisted in a mask of desperation. She wasn't looking for the deed anymore. She was looking for the toxicology report. She knew that as long as I held that paper, she was 1 phone call away from a felony charge in Oregon. I cleared my throat loudly from the bedroom. The scratching stopped instantly. I heard her retreating footsteps, the frantic click of her heels on the hardwood. I got dressed and headed to the kitchen, passing her in the hallway. She looked like a ghost, her skin sallow and her hair unwashed. "Morning, Patricia," I said, pouring a glass of water. "Still looking for something? You think you're so smart, Ted?" she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper. "But we have rights. We've lived here a year. You can't just throw us out on the street. That's elder abuse in reverse." I turned to face her, the cold air from the drafty window hitting my back. "I am not throwing you out, Patricia. I am reclaiming what you tried to steal. And as for elder abuse, I have a lab report that says you're the expert in that field." I spent the afternoon at the bank, moving my remaining savings into an account that required a 2-factor authentication tied to my phone. I saw a notification on my screen, a login attempt on my pharmacy retirement portal from an unrecognized device in Portland. She was trying to bypass my security, looking for any leverage to pay off the credit card debt Devin had confessed to. When I returned, the house felt different. The smell of something burnt, not cinnamon rolls this time, but paper, hung in the air. I rushed to my study. The lock was intact, but someone had shoved a lit match through the gap under the door. A small pile of charred mail lay on the rug. It was the formal notice from my attorney, Dorothy, reduced to black flakes. I didn't yell. I didn't even call for Devin. I simply pulled out my phone and took a photo of the burn marks. Then I opened the door and found them both in the kitchen, sitting in a heavy, guilty silence. "I hope you enjoyed the fire," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Because that was the last warning you'll get for free. Every action you take now is being logged as a criminal act." Patricia laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "Logged where? In your little clock cameras?" "I found them, Ted. Both of them." She reached into her pocket and slammed 2 smashed pieces of plastic onto the table. The digital clocks were destroyed, the lenses shattered. I looked at the wreckage, then back at her. "Those were the decoys, Patricia. The real ones are built into the smoke detectors." Her face went from triumph to a sickly pale gray in less than a second. She looked at the ceiling, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She realized then that she hadn't been fighting an old man. She had been fighting a man who spent 40 years managing a high-stakes inventory where every pill was tracked and every signature was a legal requirement. I stepped toward the table and picked up the broken plastic. "Devin, if you want to keep your marriage, that's your business. But if you want to stay out of a courtroom, you have 10 days left to get her out of my sight." I walked away. But as I reached the stairs, a sudden, sharp pain flared in my chest. Not a heart attack, but the sheer, crushing weight of realizing my own son was watching me walk into a trap and doing nothing to stop the fuse from burning. January 10th arrived with a bone-chilling Oregon rain that turned the garden into a muddy graveyard. The house felt like a pressure cooker. Patricia had stopped speaking entirely, moving through the rooms like a vengeful spirit, while Devin spent most of his time in the car, presumably looking for apartments or hiding from the fallout. I spent the morning in my study, finalizing the new will with Dorothy via a secure video call. The provision was ironclad. If I died of any cause other than documented natural progression, the house would be immediately seized by the state and sold, with all proceeds going to the Oregon Pharmaceutical Association's scholarship fund. Patricia and Devin were written out of the narrative entirely. They had no incentive to see me fail anymore. My death would be their final eviction. At noon, a knock came at the front door. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a realtor. It was Helen Carter, Patricia's mother. She looked distressed, her cream-colored coat stained with rain. "Ted, please," she said as I let her in. "We need to talk. She's in a state. She says you're threatening her with legal action over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding involves a misread prescription, Helen. It doesn't involve drugging a family member on Christmas morning to steal their home," I said, leading her into the kitchen. I pulled out the toxicology report. I had 3 copies now, one in my desk, one at the bank, and one in Dorothy's office. I slid it across the table. Helen read it in silence, her hand going to her mouth. "Oh, Patricia," she whispered. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The numbers on that page were a verdict. Helen looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mother's desperate shame. She was so worried about the debt, Ted. Devin told her he'd lost his savings in that crypto crash, and they were going to lose everything. She thought if she could just move you, she could save him. She didn't try to save him, Helen. She tried to erase me, I said, and Devin let her. That's the part that won't ever wash off. I felt a microcost of this conversation, a sharp, stinging regret that I had to expose my son's weakness to his mother-in-law. But the truth was the only weapon I had left that worked. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open. Patricia stood there, her eyes bloodshot, her hands trembling. She had been listening from the hallway. "Get out, Mom," she screamed. "We don't need your pity." "Patricia, sit down," Helen said, her voice unexpectedly firm. "You've committed a crime. Ted has the proof right here. I don't care about his proof, Patricia yelled, stepping toward me. She looked unhinged, the calculated mask of the navy blazer hostess long gone. You're an old man who's lived his life. Why do you need this big house? Why can't you just give us a chance to live ours? Because respect isn't inherited, Patricia, I said, quoting the words I'd been saving. It's earned, and you haven't earned a single square inch of this floor. She lunged for the toxicology report on the table. I was faster. I grabbed her wrist, my grip firm, the strength of a man who had spent years handling heavy glass carboys. I twisted the paper away and pushed her back toward the counter. That stays with me, I said. She stared at me, her chest heaving, and for the first time, I saw it. The realization that her power was an illusion. She was a guest who had overstayed her welcome, and the owner was home. I turned to Helen. Take her to a hotel, Helen. If she's here when the sun goes down, I'm calling the precinct. Helen nodded, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed Patricia's arm and led her toward the door. Patricia didn't fight her this time. She moved like a sleepwalker, her eyes fixed on the floorboards she had tried to steal. I watched them leave, the silver Mercedes pulling away into the gray rain. The house was half empty now, but the heaviest part was still inside. Devin was upstairs, and I knew I had one more confrontation before the locks were changed for good. Shing. The final 48 hours were the hardest. Devin stayed in the guest room, the silence between us so thick it felt like physical resistance. I spent the time packing the last of their things, not with anger, but with a methodical pharmacy-grade precision. I labeled every box, kitchen, bedroom, office. I wanted no excuses for them to return. On the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, the moving truck arrived. It was a massive orange and white beast that sat idling in the street, its exhaust plumes rising like white flags in the cold air. I stood on the porch, my hands deep in my pockets, watching the workers haul out the furniture Patricia had used to redecorate my life. Devin came out last. He was carrying a single box of books, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at me. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said. "I never wanted it to go this far." I looked at my son. I saw the boy I'd taught to ride a bike on this very sidewalk. I saw the man who had sat by and watched his wife try to poison his father. I know you didn't, Devin, but you didn't want it not to happen either. And in this house, that's the same thing. He nodded slowly, the truth of it finally sinking in. He walked to the truck, his movements heavy and mechanical. He didn't look back. Patricia was already in the car, her face a pale blur behind the tinted glass. She didn't roll down the window. She didn't scream. She just stared straight ahead as the truck pulled away, the tires squealing on the wet asphalt. I watched until the taillights vanished around the corner. Then I turned and walked back into my house. The locksmith was waiting in the foyer. He was a young man with a tool belt and a no-nonsense expression. He looked at the broken study door, the crowbar marks still visible in the wood. "Rough move?" he asked. "The roughest," I said. "I want every exterior door changed. Deadbolts on the front, the back, and the side, and I want the study door replaced with solid oak." I spent the next 3 hours watching him work. The sound of the drill was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. With every screw that went in, I felt a piece of my soul returning. The house was mine again, not just legally, but spiritually. When he was finished, he handed me a ring of 4 silver keys. They were cold and heavy in my palm. "You're all set, Mr. Wilson," he said. "Nobody's getting in here without your say-so." I thanked him and closed the door. I turned the deadbolt, the heavy thud of the brass bolt sliding home echoing through the empty hallway. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding since Christmas morning. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps hollow on the floorboards. The living room was bare where their sofa had been. The kitchen smelled of nothing but pine cleaner. I went to the back porch and sat on the steps, the same place Anne used to sit in the summer. The crocuses were still there, purple and white, defiant against the tail end of winter. They had survived the rain, the mud, and the upheaval. They were still standing. I realized then that I had lost a son, at least for now. That was the price of the house. It was a high price, a micro cost that would ache every time I saw a bike on the sidewalk or a pharmacy record with his name on it. But I had kept my dignity. I had kept my home. And I had kept the promise I'd made to Anne 35 years ago, that this house would always be a sanctuary for the truth. The first night of true solitude was the best sleep I'd had in a year. No urgent whispers from the kitchen, no floorboards creaking under the weight of someone else's secrets. I woke on February 15th to a house that felt light, the morning sun streaming through the windows and catching the dust motes in the air. I made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and sat at the dining table. I didn't read the paper. I just looked at the empty chairs. I felt a quiet emotional beat, a breathing close to the war. I was 67 years old, and for the first time in my life, I truly understood the difference between being alone and being at peace. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Devon. We found a place in Beaverton. It's small, but it's ours. Patricia is starting therapy. I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I didn't reply immediately. I took a sip of my coffee. Pure, hot, and honest. I thought about the toxicology report in the bank vault. I thought about the cameras and the smoke detectors. I wouldn't delete the footage, and I wouldn't burn the report. They would stay exactly where they were, a permanent record of the consequences of greed. I finally typed back, I hope you find what you're looking for, Devon, but don't come back here until you can look me in the eye and tell me the truth, not her truth, yours. I hit send and put the phone face down. I spent the afternoon in the garden, clearing away the dead leaves from the flower beds. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the occasional hiss of tires on the wet street. Quentin jogged by and gave me a thumbs up. I waved back, the master of my own craftsman home. As the sun began to set, painting the Portland sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, I went back inside. I walked to the study and sat in my leather chair. I pulled out a small framed photo of Anne from the desk drawer and set it on the shelf. We did it, Anne, I whispered. The house is safe. I realized then that the blockbusters of life aren't always about explosions or car chases. Sometimes they're about the quiet, decisive action of an old man who refuses to be erased. They're about the sensory jolt of a key turning in a lock that actually belongs to you. They're about the vivid image of a crocus blooming in the mud after a storm. I went to the kitchen and began to prepare a dinner for one. I used the fine china. I used the linen napkins. I treated myself like the guest of honor in the only home I would ever need. The furnace kicked on with its familiar, comforting rattle. The house breathed, and for the first time in a very long time, I breathed with it. I sat at the head of the table, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance through the craftsman windows. I was still here. I was still standing, and I was finally home. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.